He never thought his life would shrink down to a number printed in red inky, $500. Not 1,000. Not 10,000. Just 500. $500 he didn't have. $500 he couldn't borrow. $500 that might as well have been 5 million. His name was Henry Lowe, and on the day everything finally snapped, he sat at the tiny kitchen table of his one-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, staring at a utility shut, off notice he'd already crumpled and smoothed out 6 times. By the 7th time, he didn't bother. He just sat there, motionless, while the refrigerator hummed like a machine waiting to die. He could hear someone mowing the grass outside, laughing, living, while something inside him quietly shattered. That's when he heard a knock at the door that made him jump like a gunshot, and he almost didn't answer it, because he didn't want anyone to see just how far he had fallen. He opened the door expecting a neighbor, or maybe another bill collector, but instead a heavyset UPS driver stood there holding a small cardboard box. Henry hadn't ordered anything. He signed for it anyway. The package was addressed to someone else entirely, a name he didn't recognize, but the street number was right. He closed the door, confused. Then he saw something scratched on the label in pen, a message so small he didn't see it at first. It said, "If lost. Deliver by hand." He didn't know why his heart started pounding, but something told him this box wasn't a mistake. Inside was an envelope with a note written in a shaky black marker. It said, "Don't give up today." No signature, no context. Just those 4 words and nothing else. At first he thought it was some sales gimmick or prank, until he heard the second knock on his door, louder, urgent, as if whoever was out there already knew what was inside the box and wanted it back immediately. This time when he opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty, but he heard footsteps going down the stairs fading. He stepped outside for the first time in hours, clutching the box under his arm like it was something valuable. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he froze. Sitting on the curb near his apartment dumpster was a man wearing black jeans, a black hoodie, and sunglasses even though the sun had already dipped behind the buildings. At first Henry thought it was some random guy, until he recognized the face underneath the sunglasses, the hair tied loosely and streaked grey. The voice when he spoke. There was no mistaking him. It was Ozzy Osbourne. Henry blinked twice, convinced he was hallucinating. Ozzy didn't look like a celebrity or some untouchable rock legend. He just looked tired, human, and focused on Henry like he'd been waiting for him all day. Henry opened his mouth, but nothing came out, like words had abandoned him too. Ozzy motioned for him to sit. No cameras, no crowd, no tour bus. Just 2 men next to a dumpster that smelled like rotten oranges and coffee grounds. Ozzy nodded at the box tucked under Henry's arm and said in a low voice that sounded worn but steady, "You got my message." Henry stared back, confused beyond comprehension. "Why would you send something to me?" he finally managed to ask. Ozzy shrugged like the answer was obvious. "Because you were about to quit." Henry felt something stuck in his throat, a painful heat rising behind his eyes. He didn't know how to explain to a stranger, let alone a legendary musician, what giving up really looked like when nobody was watching. Ozzy didn't let him speak. He just gestured toward the envelope inside the box. "Open it." Henry started to pull the tab, and for the first time in days, he felt something that almost resembled hope, until he looked inside and everything got much stranger. Inside wasn't money, not instructions, not a letter. Just a plain white receipt from a drugstore, dated 9 years ago. On the back of the receipt, someone had scribbled another message, not the first time. Henry didn't understand. He didn't know what any of this meant. "What is this?" he asked, voice cracking. Ozzy studied him for a long moment, eyes steady, then he said something Henry would replay in his mind forever. "I was where you were once." Henry almost laughed, but it came out more like a broken exhale. Ozzy freaking Osbourne was sitting next to a Cleveland dumpster telling him he knew what it was like to lose everything over $500. It didn't make sense. He wanted answers. Before he could ask another question, Ozzy stood up and said, "Walk with me." Henry didn't think. He just followed. But 3 blocks later, he realized someone was trailing behind them, watching every move they made. And that's when things truly began to spiral. They walked past a corner market and crossed a street where buses rattled by with squealing brakes. Henry kept glancing over his shoulder, because that feeling of being followed wasn't going away. Ozzy stopped in front of an old brick building that looked like a shut-down diner. The windows were boarded. The neon sign was dark. Ozzy knocked 3 times on the boarded door like he knew a pattern. A lock clicked, and the door swung open just enough for the 2 of them to slip inside. Henry's pulse was hammering. The room inside was dim but not dark. Fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead. There were coffee cups, newspapers, furniture covered in sheets. And in the corner, pushed against a wall, was a metal safe. Ozzy walked to it like it belonged to him. Without hesitation, he bent down, placed his palm right on the safe door, and whispered something Henry couldn't hear. A second later, the safe clicked open on its own. Henry took a step back, stunned, wondering what in the world he had stumbled into. Inside the safe, instead of money or jewelry, were dozens of similar cardboard boxes, identical to the one Henry received, stacked neatly like they were waiting for something. Ozzy reached in, pulled out one box at random, and set it on the table. He looked at Henry with that same strange calm and said, "Every one of these saved somebody once." Henry's brain was spinning. "Saved them from what?" he asked. Ozzy sat down, motioning for Henry to sit across from him. Saved them from one bad day becoming the last. Henry felt his stomach drop. He didn't want to admit it, but earlier that morning he had made a decision he hadn't told anyone. No notes, no messages, no goodbye. Just a decision to end everything if he couldn't figure out what to do about the money by midnight. Ozzy must have read something in his face, because he leaned forward with quiet seriousness and said, "You think this is about bills? It's not. Bills are just the door." Henry didn't understand what that meant, and before he could ask, they both heard a sudden crash outside the boarded windows. Like someone had thrown something against the wall. Ozzy lifted a hand to silence Henry. They waited perfectly still, as footsteps shuffled outside, slow, heavy, deliberate. Then someone rattled the boarded door. Ozzy motioned Henry toward the back of the room. "We're not alone," he whispered. "We need to go." Henry's adrenaline kicked in. He didn't want to leave. He wanted answers. Ozzy grabbed the box from the safe and tucked it under his arm, then guided Henry through a narrow hallway into the back alley. The moment the door slammed behind them, Henry heard the front door of the building break open like someone had kicked it in. They ran. Henry wasn't a runner, but fear made his legs move. Ozzy stayed surprisingly quick for someone his age, weaving through alleys like he'd memorized them. Finally, they slid behind a dumpster behind a laundromat, gasping. Henry clutched his knees, breathing hard. "What is happening?" he whispered. Ozzy looked back toward the building they had just left and said, "You're not the only one who gets these boxes, and not everybody wants saving." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Henry thought about every bill on his table, every unanswered voicemail. Every night he stayed awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quiet death might be. Suddenly those problems felt smaller, but also more dangerous, like they led into something larger than he ever imagined. Ozzy finally turned to face him. "You're in a choice moment," he said. "Either walk away right now and pretend nothing happened, or follow this all the way to the end." Henry thought of the envelope with no money in it, just a weird message. He thought of the safe full of boxes. He thought of the footsteps following them. And he thought of the dark decision he had made earlier that morning. Before he could answer, Ozzy reached into that second box he grabbed and pulled out something unexpected, a photograph. It was a picture of a woman Henry had never seen before, standing in front of a burned-down house, holding a single intact family photo. On the back was a handwritten note. This was her one thing worth staying for. Henry felt a chill run straight through him. Ozzy closed the box. People think help comes in money. Sometimes it does. But the real thing is a reason, he said. Henry stared at him. Why me? He asked. Ozzy cracked a tiny smile. Because you're still asking questions. Henry didn't know how to respond. He had spent so many months feeling invisible, like he could disappear and not a single person on earth would notice. Now here he was sitting in an alley behind a laundromat with Ozzy Osbourne telling him his life wasn't random. The weird part was he believed him. Suddenly Henry remembered the feeling of being followed, and he glanced out of the alley expecting that shadow to reappear. But the alley was empty. Ozzy stood up, looked toward the street, and nodded. Let's go, he said. There's one more thing you need to see. Henry swallowed hard and followed him out, not knowing the next place would break him open in a way no bill ever could. They walked to an abandoned train platform near the edge of town. The wind was cold, and the tracks sang a metallic hum whenever a train passed several blocks away. Ozzy led him to a bench where a single faded business card rested, held down by a rock. Henry picked it up. It was for a local church food pantry. On the back, another message. The first box. Henry felt a sudden realization snap into place. This was a chain, a pattern. These boxes, these messages, these strange deliveries. They weren't random acts of celebrity kindness or dramatic interventions. They were part of something organized, something secret, something ongoing. Ozzy sat down beside him on the bench. 9 years ago, someone saved me with one of those boxes, he said quietly. I thought about quitting then too. It wasn't money that saved me. It was the idea that someone was watching and cared. Henry stared at him. And now you're doing it for others? Ozzy nodded. When I can. Henry's voice trembled. What about the people chasing us? Ozzy looked out toward the empty tracks and said, Some people don't like change. Henry started laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because his brain was trying to release something locked inside it for months. He rubbed his eyes. I still owe $500, he said. Ozzy nodded. Yes, and that matters, but you're alive to deal with it. That matters more. Henry looked at the envelope again, the one that said, Don't give up today. He finally understood it wasn't a solution. It was permission to breathe, to fight through one more day. Henry sat there for a long time, thinking about that. Then Ozzy asked a question so simple and direct Henry didn't know how to answer at first. What if today isn't the day you quit? Henry felt tears spill out before he could stop them. Because for the first time, it genuinely seemed possible. Before he could say anything, a train passed a block away, loud, screeching, and in that moment he saw someone standing on the rooftop across the street, watching them. Henry's breathing quickened. Ozzy stood up like he had expected this. We're almost done, he said. But one more thing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn red wallet. He handed it to Henry. Open it. Henry unzipped the wallet and gasped. Inside was a stack of bills. Hundreds, enough to cover his 500 and more. But Ozzy shook his head. Not yet, he said. Don't use that to pay bills today. Use it to get one good meal, sleep, breathe. You clear your head first. Henry was speechless. He had never had someone give him money like that. It felt surreal. Ozzy closed Henry's hand around the wallet. If you only remembered the money, you'd miss the real message. Henry nodded slowly. Ozzy stepped back. Now go home, he said. Rest. And when you wake up tomorrow, choose differently. Henry wanted to thank him. Say something meaningful, something worthy of this strange miracle. But when he looked up, Ozzy was already walking away, disappearing down the street like he was just another guy finishing a day's work. Henry looked around for the figure on the rooftop, but they were gone. He walked home under streetlights flickering on one by one. By the time he reached his apartment, something had shifted inside him. The refrigerator still hummed, the bills still sat on the table. The shut-off notice still glared in red ink. But Henry wasn't drowning anymore. He took a deep breath, sat down, and for the first time in weeks, he slept. He didn't know if Ozzy would ever come back, or if anyone would believe what happened. But the next morning, something strange occurred. On his doormat was another cardboard box, identical to the first one. No address, no postage, just sitting there like it had been placed with care. Henry stared at it for a long time before picking it up. His hands shook. Inside the box was a single paper scrap with one handwritten sentence. "Today is not the day." Henry sat on the floor, holding that message like it weighed something more than paper. And behind him, in the hallway outside his apartment, the sound of footsteps paused for a moment, then faded, as if someone had delivered hope and walked away before he could open the door. He didn't know what tomorrow looked like, or next week, or next year. But he knew this: he wasn't giving up today, not after everything he saw. Not after Ozzy Osbourne showed up beside a dumpster and changed his life with a cardboard box. And somewhere out there, another box was waiting for someone else on the edge of quitting, another person on the brink over something as small and as massive as $500. But for Henry, this was just the beginning, because the next sound he heard was another knock at the door. And this time, when he opened it, someone was standing there holding a box of their own.